Right, well, I'm going to do a little bit on some of the basics of, I guess, from an engineering perspective. Having a male brain myself, I like kind of engineering analogies. I like that kind of structure, but I think it is a helpful way to look at things, being that, like it or not, we have a very male-dominated academic system and political system, so trying to distill this stuff down into things that kind of make sense in that way. So I'm going to use some engineering analogies. Obviously, that's not necessarily how things work exactly, but I think it's a useful way of looking at things. So really, this is about the basic design, construction, and fuel requirements of a complex system. It could be any animal, or it could be something that would be more of a typical engineering project. And in particular, looking at design. And when I say design, talking about biological systems, we're really talking about DNA being some kind of blueprint, some kind of plan, and the design element is how you read the DNA. Something that didn't get a lot of attention for a long time. It's starting to get a lot more attention now, the last 10 to 20 years. So we're going to be looking at that. Also going to be looking at construction materials. Basically in engineering, you have these kind of areas of specifications, design specification, construction materials. You'd have specific construction materials for specific designs. And similar with fuel, you'd have a specification for fuel. The example I've used here just to demonstrate the principle is, I think it's supposed to be a Ferrari, sort of classic aspirational icon. I don't know if anybody here would be interested in owning a Ferrari, but if you were given one, if you inherited one, if you had any sense, you might want to know a little bit about its history, where it was built, how it was built, and if it was in need of a service or any repair, you'd probably want to know its basic design and specifications, so you got the right parts for it, you put the right fuel in it, kind of stuff we might take for granted. But obviously I'm applying this to our human system as well. So modern sports car would be considered fairly advanced. And going into the design a bit more to get everything to fit together and to work well and to work for a long time, and running near the limits of its ability, which is what these things are designed to do, you have to get the design spot on. There's very little scope for maneuver with design. Change your design parameters by, let's say, 1%, change the measurements by 1%. You're probably not going to be able to get this to build. You're not going to get it to join together. Even if you could, it's probably not going to work, or it won't work very well. So design, incredibly important. Not much leeway with design for complex engineering systems. Tiny changes, big impact, probably isn't going to work at all. So say 1 or 2%, it's not going to work. Construction materials, what's it built from? Well, again, something like this would be considered reasonably high spec. They'll be using high spec alloys and various things like that. But typically you've got a bit more latitude. If you build it from something maybe not quite so good, it's probably still going to work. It might not work as well, it might not last as long, but it's probably still going to work. And similar with fuel. Again, you'd probably have some high octane, very clean fuel for this, but if you put something in that wasn't quite right, probably still going to fire up, probably still going to work. Might not run as smoothly, might not last as long, you might do a little bit of long-term damage. But the point is that these are all key parameters. This one is absolutely essential. It's key. You can't change it very much. These, you've got a little bit more flexibility, but not a huge amount. For example, if you built a 747 from plywood, really well built, followed the design, painted it all look nice, nobody would get on it, because clearly it couldn't cope with what it's supposed to do. So hold those thoughts when we start looking at what we've done to the human system. So going back to these basics in design, construction materials, how far do you go back? Well, you could argue we could start in a cosmological sense, and that's all fascinating, but I'm actually just going to pick it up with biology, because I think that's most relevant, most easy to get your head around. Obviously, at some level, we're all made from stardust, and we don't even know what it is. We've got fancy names for it, but nobody's got a clue, really. It's, you know, once you get past electrons and protons, it's some weird energy, and we're all built from that. But never mind, we're going to start with, this is a sort of blueprint. In biology, it's generally seen as DNA. I think it's a good theory. Obviously, DNA, turns out, seems to do more and more as the research goes on. But as a basic design, basic blueprint, it seems to be the library where all the information is stored. And current thinking, and has been for a long time, is that changes in the library, changes in the DNA code, is where we get a lot of the change from. We can get what's called mutations or changes, and it changes the ultimate design. And if it's useful, we'll retain it. If it's not, it'll get lost. And that theory's been around for quite a long time, sort of adaptive selection. And I think it's got a lot of merits. It seems to explain an awful lot about the biological world. However, there's another way to get design changes out of DNA, and it's got nothing to do with changing the actual blueprint. It's about how you read the blueprint. You can read the blueprint in such a way that you'll get a very different design out of it. And in biological systems, key components in the reading, or in the design, if you like, are hormones. I'm sure you've all heard of hormones. Some of the key ones in mammals and in humans, steroid hormones, such as estrogens and testosterone. They effectively read the DNA, tell the DNA what to build. And they're incredibly powerful. You change the action, the activity of these hormones by a minuscule amount, and you get radically different results. Good example would be, as an adult male, if I started taking a lot of estrogen, it doesn't change my DNA code, but it will tell my DNA to do something different. It'll change my whole physiology. Most obvious example is I'll start growing breasts. Even at my age, that's what would happen. That's how powerful hormones are. It would also change my brain structure, it would change everything to some degree. In fact, one of the key differences in getting sexual differentiation, getting a male and female, is hormones. The DNA is not that different. But in males, we have a piece of DNA that effectively tells us to pump more testosterone. So we all start off basically as a female design, hence males having nipples. We're basically essentially female, and as the hormones kick in at different stages, it turns us into an altered female, basically. That's what a male is. So I'm just emphasizing the power of hormones, incredibly powerful, and they're telling the DNA what to build. Stick with this one a bit. So, taking all that on board, if you can, and thinking about our archaic environment, this forest environment I was talking about, general agreement that the vast part of our evolution was spent in the forest, and only more recently did we leave the forest. And again, there's various theories and arguments as to why that was. But for a long time, we're in the forest. This molecular ecology, off-the-scale complexity, most complex ecology we know. Not only were we living there, but like a lot of species, we'd formed a particular kind of relationship with the forest, generally termed a symbiotic relationship. So it wasn't just that we were casually living there, we'd engaged with the forest, we'd played a role in the forest. Parallels with a lot of insects, for example. Forest trees, the flowering plants in particular, so the plants that have flowers and can produce fruit, they've been around for between 1 and 200 million years, according to current thinking. And the flowering plants tend to be much more complex. They produce a lot more biochemistry than the plants that went before them, the conifers, the ferns, and so on. And not only that, they've managed to effectively abduct, kidnap, cajole, seduce many species into their sexual reproduction. So the plant sex organs, or the flowering plant sex organs, are the flowers. And to improve their reproductive ability, they've involved things like insects. Think of pollination, where insects will visit the flower, take the pollen, which is the equivalent of sperm, to another flower, and you get conception, reproduction. And these relationships have gone on for a long time, and some of these relationships become so entangled that you can end up with a species of flowering plant that has a very, very specific flower and an insect that has a very specific shape. The two of them have co-evolved for so long they've become effectively the same thing. If one or the other dies, the other one dies as well. So the insect dies out, the plant dies out, vice versa. So these relationships can become incredibly entangled. They become the same organism to some degree. So yeah, insects, the reward was a sweet treat, nectar, or some of the pollen. Some of the pollen was some of the treat, or even eating some of the flowers. With primates and some other species as well, that relationship developed, again, over a long period of time. The thinking is our very distant ancestors were insectivorous. It's going way back. And the thinking is that in pursuit of insects, who were beginning to form these relationships with the flowers, our ancestors pursued the insects up the trees and then eventually began a similar relationship with the plants. Initially pollination, perhaps, eating the flowers. Primates still eat flowers. Still a lot of flowers that are edible today. But over time, the plants responded. And instead of just nectar or pollen, the sex organs began to swell. And they were using the chemistry, the sex organ chemistry, and the sugar that was already on offer as nectar was incorporated into it. And you ended up with these swollen sex organs, sweet sex organs. So that became the reward. And in this case, it went from pollination. Pollination's still part of the deal, but it became seed dissemination. We became responsible for carrying the seeds away from the tree and giving them a much better chance of spreading and procreating. And these relationships can develop quite quickly. You can imagine if a tree starts producing a particularly beneficial free lunch, it's very nutritious, it's got some chemistry and that makes you feel good, that's what you're going to eat, and that quickly is going to spread. So the evidence is quite good for this. Our physiology supports it, that we formed this relationship with the forest, we formed this relationship with trees, primarily as fruit eaters. But I want you to forget fruit. It's not an appropriate word. It's really the swollen reproductive organ, the swollen female reproductive organ of the flowering plants. And if you think about that for a minute, out of all the relationships that have ever gone on, all the fossil evidence, forming a relationship where you ingest the sex organs, not of another species, but of a whole other kingdom, is pretty weird. For example, if we'd specialized in going out into the savannah and eating the sex organs of the wildebeest, there'd be programs on it all the time. It would be quite strange. Well, actually, we're doing this with the flowering plants for millions of years. So, reproductive organ of the flowering plants. Well, you then have to start thinking about what the reproductive organ of the plant is. And very loosely, you could say it's equivalent to the mammalian system, the uterus, the ovaries, and so on. It's designed, highly specialized design, and it's to do with the embryonic form of plants. It's where the seeds develop, very early form of plants, and it's loaded with a very different hormone regime or hormonally active compounds than the rest of the tree. Very specialized area, a bit like the mammalian reproductive system. And we're ingesting this stuff all the time. millions of years ago, 24/7. Well, actually, the only place you can do this, a lot of species do eat fruit, but it's typically seasonally. In this climate, for example, there's some kinds of fruit around from maybe, if you're lucky, June onwards, 4 to 6 months. If you're lucky, there might be some berries, there might be some fruit around. There are places where you can get fruit 24/7. They're very small niches in the tropical forest. You get subtropical, then tropical forest, but most tropical forest is seasonal. You get a wet season and a dry season. And it's a little bit like winter and summer. The plants respond and they tend to fruit when things are good. And lots of animals tailor their reproductive cycle around that. But within that, you get these niches, these non-seasonal tropical forests, where basically there isn't a wet or dry season. Right on the equator, so there's no real variation in day length, an hour or two at most. It rains a bit, it's warm all the time, and you get perpetual fruiting. Fruit on offer all the time. And it fits our physiology very well. We've got a very, very poor water handling physiology. We're very inefficient with water. I have all these theories about the savannah, but people have been querying this for a long time. It's, well, we desperately need water. We cannot survive very long without water. It doesn't matter if you live in a place that's perpetually raining and your diet's full of water. And our physiology supports that. So the idea is, anyway, we develop this specialized relationship and we're ingesting the reproductive organs of plants. You then have to start thinking, what impact is that going to have? And plants, like animals, they have DNA, and their DNA is read by hormonally active compounds. Same basic plot. So instead of our own mammalian hormones running the show, we're now immersing ourselves effectively or infusing ourselves with the hormonally active compounds of plants, their reproductive hormones. And that's all about juvenility. It's a feminizing environment as well. It's for the most part, it's the swollen female organ. So we're flooding our system with these hormones. So going back to design, remember I was saying our basic design is dictated to by hormones. And there's evidence in our evolutionary past we formed a relationship with hormonally active compounds, loaded with them, flooding our system with them. So you then start having to ask what impact that might have, which we'll get on to. In addition, I was talking about construction materials. So again, tropical forest ecology, ecology of fruit, the molecular ecology, incredibly complex. I think the tropical forest's most complex ecology we know. I've said that several times. I'll probably say it several times more. And you get all that funneled into a reproductive environment. And it's evolved to be eaten. There's no toxic defense. It's not like leaves or seeds. This stuff wants to be eaten. I use the analogy sometimes like the tropical trees were in competition with each other, almost like drug dealers or prostitutes. They were stood on the corner of the forest and waving their ever-swollen, gaudy sex organs looking for trade. And there was competition between the trees. The most appetizing trees would do the best. So there's like chemical warfare going on. Produce the most nutritious, best food, and you're going to do very well. And that was going on for millions of years. In addition to hormones, as I say, very complex biochemistry. Also simple sugars. Plants are very good at making simple sugars. This thing runs on simple sugars. And also incredibly rich in antioxidants. If you're building a brain, building a big neural system, it's basically made from fatty acids. They oxidize very easily damaged. Not a problem if you're living in an environment where you're flooding yourself with all the classic vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin E, but also classes of compounds called flavonoids, which I'll talk a bit more about in a while. Highly antioxidant, highly protective. So again, perfect environment to build a big neural system. Let's say fuel, well, you've got neurochemical fuel. A lot of the compounds in plant chemistry are neuroactive, and also simple sugars. So everything's there. So I'm really just pointing out what to me seems obvious. This mystery of human origins and how can we grow such a large brain that at least has elements of high intelligence. Well, we've got this particular unique environment, and with it a particularly unique relationship, ingesting the reproductive organs. Is there a connection there? Is it possible? Well, we can already see that unusual neural systems do emerge from the forest-dwelling apes. If it wasn't for humans and some of our extinct relatives, if we were visiting planet Earth as an alien anthropologist or something, we'd look at the forest and go, what's going on there? Forests are one of the very few places that produce large neural systems. And yet it's had very little attention in the last 50 years. There's been this obsession to find the answers in places that have never grown large neural systems. Really simple idea. So what we're going to look at next is how some of these mechanisms might have worked and how eventually that spills over into our current state of mind. As I say, it might seem like a lot of disconnected information, but hopefully towards the end it'll come together. So really just saying here that the idea that somehow the most complex molecular ecology in this incredibly unique relationship, eating the sex organs of another kingdom, wasn't somehow integral to our evolution seems absurd to me. It's not just something that we went through a phase, it didn't affect us. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail here as to how this might have worked. And going back to hormones, our own hormones again, I mentioned things like testosterone and estrogens. They play an enormous role in every aspect of our growth and development. They basically trigger the timing for things and the structure for things, and they're incredibly powerful, as I've already said. Tiny amounts, tiny changes in amounts can have a massive impact. And it kind of works something like this. So we have the code. The code is read by the hormones, tells the DNA what to build. And amongst it builds a whole physiology, but also dictates our neural system, what kind of neural system we have, what the structure will be. And ultimately that will dictate what kind of function it has. But interestingly, our neural system plays a major role in running the hormone system. It's actually called the neuroendocrine system. So our neural system manages the hormone system. So the hormone system's telling the DNA what to build, tells it what kind of brain to build. Brain's actually running the hormone system. So you kind of have a fairly stable loop there. In the female line and the maternal line, this loop, however this loop works, impacts on the next generation in the uterus. So you change something here, it's going to change this, going to change this, also going to change this. And as I said earlier, a lot of focus on changes in the DNA code. I'll also mention as well, you may be familiar with that hormones, they dictate structure, they also dictate developmental windows. One of the key things they regulate is our juvenile period, before we become sexually mature. And humans and some of the other primates have unusually long juvenile periods before we become adults, and it's hormones that dictate that. The hormones change as we go into puberty, we pump a lot more of them, and it changes a lot of structure, changes a lot of things. We become adult, we become sexually mature. It's also kind of when aging starts. But looking at it the other way on, you need a long juvenile period because that's when our brain grows. It tends to slow down as puberty kicks in and the structure of our brain changes, becomes more of an adult brain. It's kind of the normal way of things in mammals. Juvenile window, juvenile brain, juvenile brains tend to have a psychology tend to be more playful, more curious. There's perpetual appetite for novelty and information, less aggressive. Just generally more playful. And you see this in a lot of species, even quite aggressive species. The young can be very playful. Once the hormones kick in, turns us into adults and also turns us into an adult brain. And the adult brain becomes, it's a process called differentiation, changes the structure of the cells that become more rigid. It's like what we learn in our juvenile years, that's kind of what we have for the rest of our lives, more or less. That's how it works with a lot of species. Highly plastic window for learning, brain matures, becomes more rigid, and it gets difficult to learn new things. The classic idea of old dogs, new tricks, there's a lot of truth in that. So anyway, this is the loop. And again, current thinking is our very ancient ancestors were insectivorous, and what enters this loop through diet generally doesn't have a massive impact on the hormone regime, developing the brain, endocrine system, and so on. Can have a little bit of an impact, but it's not a huge impact. But if you switch from this to this, remember, this isn't fruit anymore. This is now the swollen reproductive organs of the flowering plants. Of course, reproductive organs, highly evolved, they're designed to read DNA differently. You start pouring this into this loop, and it's going to have an impact. Basically pouring hormonally active compounds in, it's going to tell the DNA to do something different. It'll create a different brain, it'll run the endocrine system differently, and you're getting into a whole new territory. In fact, the pharmacology, the kind of chemistry of fruit, wasn't much on it 20, 30 years ago, but in the last 20 to 30 years, and particularly the last 10 years, there's been a huge amount of research on the compounds in plants generally, also in fruits. I mentioned one group of them, a very large group, flavonoids. Hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of flavonoids, some quite common, some not so common, play many roles in the plant. One of the roles they play, tend to be pigments, or a lot of them are pigments that give things color. So you can imagine in a co-evolving relationship where you're trying to attract, again, it's like a seduction. So the idea that the fruit's swelling and there's various colors. Remember, humans have color vision. Such a powerful relationship, we develop very good color vision. The idea is once this starts flowing into the system, it has a big impact. And one of the things the flavonoids do is they inhibit the activity of our own steroids. So things like testosterone and estrogen become diluted and inhibited by these compounds in plants. So again, if you can carry these things forward, remember hormones, steroids like estrogen and testosterone play a massive role in all mammals. It's a fairly stable role. The hormone levels dictate what's read by the DNA. Brain runs the endocrine system. It's closed loop, very, very powerful. And it all runs very well, it all works fine. Though you do tend to end up with a typical mammalian system, which usually wants to mature quite quickly. It's about reproduction. And most mammalian brains, well, the evidence has changed a little bit, but most mammalian brains tend don't show a huge amount of evidence of being self-aware, particularly empathic, compassionate, highly intelligent, and so on. They tend to be about survival. Mature rapidly, reproduce, mature rapidly, reproduce. But I think when this starts entering the equation, start putting the brakes on that maturation process, slows everything down, which gives us an opportunity to build a bigger brain. But more importantly, I think, what kind of brain? And instead of a rapidly maturing brain, I think we ended up with an expanding brain that was increasingly immature, more childlike, particularly the new brain, the neocortex. and that brings with it a very different psychology. Again, I've already touched on it. Adult brains tend to be, particularly mammalian brains, more aggressive, more hierarchical. In males, particularly as testosterone kicks in, definitely more aggression, more competition. But prior to that, juveniles of either sex tend to be more similar. There's less difference between the sexes during the juvenile phase. And there's these other psychological traits, say this playfulness, this perpetual curiosity, more empathy, more compassion. So in essence, what I'm proposing is our relationship with the female reproductive organs of plants. Remember, feminizing and juvenile inducing, this is what this stuff does, impacted on our own hormone system and created a more juvenile environment and a progressively juvenile environment. Why? Because as you start building a more juvenile brain, so neocortex begins to expand, it begins influencing the endocrine system and running a more juvenile endocrine system. So you end up in a scenario where the fruit's kind of dictating this process, but as our brain expands and becomes more juvenile, it starts adding to that equation and eventually becomes a more powerful element. We end up with a much more juvenile brain that produces a much more juvenile hormone regime, which feeds back into the system, and you end up potentially with a kind of runaway feedback loop, rapid expansion, and a very, very different kind of brain. So there's a lot to take in. Like I say, hopefully it'll begin to make sense as time goes on. And the fossil record suggests something utterly bizarre happened with humans and some of our relatives. Neural systems are typically very expensive to build and very expensive to run, and very delicate, very difficult to maintain. I think I already mentioned that typically superstructures made of fatty acids, things like omega-3 fatty acids. And fatty acids tend to be very delicate. They'll oxidize at room temperature. In nature, you always find them highly protected, wrapped up in layers and layers of what we call antioxidants, vitamin E's, vitamin C's, flavonoids, and so on. Currently, we tend to take them out of that matrix, isolate them, and then heat them in free oxygen, what we call cooking, and then we build the most complex superstructure we know from them. But in our ancient past, this was always protected. The fruit was flooding in, full of antioxidants, and allowed this colossal brain to emerge in a highly protected environment. You think, I mean, how it's portrayed in movies and so on, if you're looking at the manufacture of microchips, people are in white coats, it's all anti-static, there's filters everywhere. A single neural cell is way, way more complex than anything we've ever invented. Ferraris, space shuttles, whatever. We've got tens of billions of them all working in harmony. So our neural system is regarded as the most complex thing we currently know. You wouldn't think, when the way we treat it, what we build it from currently, that was the case. And it's highly responsive to changes in biochemistry. I'm sure you're aware we have lots of laws to stop us changing the biochemistry of our neural system. And yet in our past, we formed a relationship with the most complex neurochemical environment we could think of. And out of that came a very large brain. Now, weak link in this loop, remember this loop is pretty stable. This kind of addition to the loop you'd think is potentially stable. Tropical forests can be stable for millions of years. They're so kind of complex they can produce their own weather. But they are subject to extreme climatic change. In the African forests, where the evidence suggests we evolved in the last several million years, aren't quite as wet as the Asiatic and South American tropical forests. They are wet enough to be tropical forests, but there's not an overabundance of rain. And if you get global drying, and the evidence suggests this does happen on a cyclical basis, sometimes very severe drying, the tropical forest will contract. The non-seasonal niches that I was talking about will also contract. A contraction wouldn't be a huge problem, but if you get a very severe drying, the forest can virtually disappear altogether, and the evidence supports that does happen from time to time. The pollen records suggest that where there was tropical forest, the pollen can change to grassland, more like savanna or even arid conditions. So this is the Achilles heel in this equation. If this was responsible for driving the evolution of a very unique kind of brain, large, yes, but also a different kind of structure, and this always underpinned it, this was providing the fuel, the build quality, and everything else, potentially you can lose this. If the forest contracts enough, if it dries out enough, you end up with gallery forests along the river. That's it. The whole lot can go. And if your neural system, and ultimately your state of mind, remember structure ultimately correlates with function. So basically our state of mind, our state of consciousness was entirely dependent on this relationship, and the fruit disappeared, then we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be exposed to our very own ancient hormone regime. We're going to be back to testosterones and estrogens. And they do a great job, they always did. But they're in a hurry. They want to build a quick, rapidly maturing species with a brain that's good for surviving. And that's about competition and aggression and all the kind of things we've probably read and heard about. I think that's exactly what happened, and again it ties in with these ancient mythologies. Forest dwelling, a unique state of mind, ecological catastrophes, something changed and we began to change. I'm going to suggest what actually happened is the technical term is kind of reverting to type. The forest and the fruit, it was actually the forest and the fruit built as a very special neural system, a very special perceptual system. And when the forest disappeared, being exposed to our own ancient hormones again, they've simply tried to do what they always do, which is build a very basic mammalian brain. It's not too bright, it's not too empathic, it's quite aggressive. Once it's mature, it's not very good at learning new things. And the major effect, again, was hormonal, but we're also looking at a radical change in construction materials and fuel, going from very unique to what initially what would have been fallback foods. Fallback foods is a term used for what primates will eat when the going gets tough, if there's a dry period and so on. Nothing like the complexity of this. Enough to keep you alive. It's not about whether you'd survive or not, but radical, radical change. Massive impact on our hormone system, massive change in build quality, construction materials, and fuel. And the net effect, I think, isn't whether we'd survive or not, it's what impact that has on our very unique neural system. So instead of being in this perpetual state of juvenility with all these amazing traits and abilities, our neural system begins to start reverting to a more primitive form, maturing more quickly. It's kind of counterintuitive. You think, well, the whole point is to mature and grow up. But I think the thing that set us apart was, remember, the reproductive environment, which is all about the juvenile state, kept us in a juvenile state, built us a massive juvenile brain, and that gave us phenomenally different sense of self, with a lot of childlike qualities in a positive way, in terms of our psychology and our behavior. So this kicks in, forest gone, and this is where a lot of academia has been looking for answers as to how we built our brain. I think by the time we get here, it's the forest that built our brain. It's not that we can't survive here, it's tough. And there's evidence that humans, almost didn't make it at various points. If you're in an environment where the food's dropping off the tree, non-seasonal forest is usually buffered by hundreds of miles of tropical forest, so you don't have grassland, you don't have huge herds of grass-eating animals, so you don't have the massive predators. So deep in the forest, it's relatively benign. It's the kind of place this kind of thing could happen. If you're evolving a neural system that's not very aggressive, it's not very competitive, try to do it out here, and within 10 minutes you're going to get eaten. But in here, deep in the forest, there's not so much going to eat you. And with this new brain comes a lot of intelligence anyway, and the few things that are there can be dealt with. Once you get out here, very different. So the idea is the forest built our highly intelligent juvenile brain, then at some point the forest disappeared, but the brain, the heritage we had, we could survive here. But all the while the clock's ticking, this kind of cycle as it goes through the generations, we're losing the juvenility, more mature, more adult endocrine system is building a more adult brain, and that goes on and on through the generations and accelerates with time. And interestingly enough, loads and loads of stuff written about the expansion of our brain, triples in size in a couple of millions of years. We've got a big brain, aren't we cool? A lot of data around now has been for at least 20 years, and slowly more written about it, that our brain stopped expanding. It was expanding on an accelerating curve, which is very unusual in nature. And bearing in mind how expensive this is to build, how expensive it is to run, it uses about 20% of all our fuel, our energy. Stopped expanding. So it's going like this, rapid expansion curve. It stopped expanding roughly 200,000 years ago. That date may change as new finds emerge. And more interesting to me, it's been shrinking. Our neural system's been shrinking. That would worry me if, I came across that evidence. Massive expansion stops and it's been shrinking. In fact, there's some estimates that we've lost roughly a tennis ball's worth of neural tissue. As it happens, I think more important than the amount we've lost is the kind of structure you lost, but we'll get into that a bit more. Anyway, you can see swapping fruit for this kind of stuff, massive, massive change. Some biochemistry here, but nothing like as much as in fruit. And recycling mammalian, like eating other mammals, yes, it'll keep you alive, but all you're really doing is recycling typical mammalian hormones, the very hormones that were being suppressed by the plant biochemistry to build something unique. You start eating this stuff, and it's accelerating that process. And then, of course, in more hostile environments, remember, we've got an intelligent mind, so we come up with solutions to hostile environments where there's bugger all to eat, to be honest, for primates. Most of the stuff we eat now, we couldn't eat unless we processed it. That should tell us something about it. It's not a natural primate food. Most plants, and animals for that matter, don't want to be eaten. Plants defend themselves chemically, pour in lots of chemicals that cause all sorts of problems, unless you're talking about fruit, which of course wants to be eaten, so you don't have that problem. This is like the ultimate free lunch. And one way to turn food that's dangerous or toxic into something you can ingest without it killing you is to denature it with heat, change a molecular structure with heat, fire, cooking, all that kind of stuff. Often seen as a major step forward in our advancement. Once we started cooking stuff, we grew a big brain. I think we have it back to front. Once we started cooking, yes, we could survive in extremely hostile environments, but the chemistry changed from biochemistry, at least when we go back here, we're talking, this is still biochemistry. Now we're talking about chemistry, massive, massive change. Once we're heating stuff up, it's something that's never been part of biological evolution for hundreds of millions or even billions of years. Completely novel stuff. We're building the most complex thing we know all of a sudden from this material. And it's chemically very impoverished, no comparison to the forest. And then by the time we get to the modern civilization, there's no resemblance to anything at all. You know, we laughingly call it junk food. And we're using this stuff to build the most complex thing we know, as far as we can tell, is responsible for all our decisions, our behavior, and everything else. Pretty obvious. So again, just another summary. And I've been running this by researchers in various fields for quite a long time now. And it staggers me even now that such simple connections where the evidence is already there. I mean, none of this stuff is new. The pieces aren't new. It's just rearranging them so they fit a bit better. And it just hasn't occurred to anybody. We've become programmed to expect to find solutions in hostile environments. The only place we could evolve a big brain is in a hostile environment through genetic mutation, because it works for so many other species. And yet we know humans lived in an environment where we were ingesting stuff that must have had a massive impact on the way the DNA was read, and all the trends suggest a more juvenile physiology that is exactly what you need to build a big brain, and so on and so on. So I'm going to have another break now. I'm hoping this information is starting to build up. I'm still getting the impression it's a lot of information and not all the connections have been made, but we have got 2 more sessions to go, so it will eventually join together, I hope.